Upstream, and welcome to our panel on the state of the open source maintainer 2023. We just released the results of our new maintainer survey report a couple of weeks ago, and I brought together a panel of my friends to talk with me today about this, some people who in many cases I've known for a long time, and I'm going to take a minute here just to let them introduce themselves to you, and hopefully this will be a really fun conversation. So thanks to everyone who's joined us today. Seth, let's start with you if you want to introduce yourself.
Yeah, sure thing. So I'm Seth Larson. I am an open source maintainer. I maintain urlib3, which is the most downloaded Python package on the Python package index, along with a bunch of other packages that are related to that one. And then for my full-time job, I work at Elastic. I'm a tech lead for the language clients team, which is kind of a dev advocate / engineering role. It's quite a fun job to have. Just a ton of open source on my end, honestly.
Well, welcome. Thanks for joining us here today, Seth. And Lauren, why don't you go next?
Sure. I'm Lauren Hanford. I'm the VP of Product here at Tidelift. So I am responsible for the teams that do product discovery and delivery. We get to work closely with open source maintainers like Seth, and then we get to work closely with enterprise customers on the industry side as well.
Thanks, Lauren. And Al.
Hey, thanks, Chris. I'm happy to be here. Al Gillen, I'm a group vice president at IDC. We're a market research firm that looks at industry trends. So you can kind of think of us as analysts, sort of like stock analysts, but we don't look at stock prices. We look at the industry and the markets and the technologies themselves. At IDC, I've actually been looking at open source software for about 20 years. So I've watched this really amazing transition take place where open source moved from kind of a wannabe technology back in the late 1990s and something that enterprises were largely shy of, to where it is today, mainstream and used broadly, and developing new challenges as we'll talk about today.
Awesome. Well, thanks for joining us, Al. And I'm Chris Grams. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer of Tidelift. I'm also a little bit of a data nerd. I've been doing this sort of survey analysis for a long time. I love doing these surveys, and I love looking at the results, and I love sharing the results with my friends. So thank you all for joining me. As you can see here, we have a diverse set of perspectives. So we'll be able to, Al will hopefully be able to give us some industry perspectives on this data. Seth will give us some first-person experience of whether this tracks with his experience of being an open source maintainer. And Lauren has sort of a broad view into what maintainers are thinking and doing and willing to do from the research she's been doing on the Tidelift product side over the last few years. So let's dive in. First off, let me give a little bit of background on this survey report that we just released. And you can download this directly from the Tidelift website if you're interested in reading the report in more detail after this. But this is the second time we've done a survey of open source maintainers. We did our first one about 2 years ago. We had respondents from all around the world, over 300 people, and a very diverse set of maintainers in terms of some of them maintain just one project, some of them maintain lots of projects. Some of these maintainers are solo maintainers, as you'll see in some of the stats we show later. Some have many co-maintainers. So lots of different perspectives are brought together in this. And the way I'm going to organize this conversation today is we're really going to talk in 3 different parts. We're going to first start by talking about the experience of maintainers when it comes to money, which is something that you'll hear a lot about in Upstream today. And there's a lot of active threads of conversation going on about. We're going to show you some stats. Then we're also going to talk about some of the new and emerging industry and government standards and how maintainers approach those standards and how they're thinking about those standards. And then thirdly, we're going to talk about the underlying motivations of maintainers. Why do they do the work they do on these open source packages, and hopefully get some interesting perspectives here. So let's dive in. First topic that I wanted to talk about for a few minutes is maintainers and money. So the top level finding that is really, really interesting around this is we asked maintainers a question: which of the following phrases best describes how you approach your role as an open source maintainer? And of the maintainers that we asked this question, 60% answered that they are unpaid hobbyists. only 23% describe themselves as semi-professional maintainers, by which that means that they earn some of their income from maintaining projects, and only 13% describe themselves as full professional maintainers who earn most or all of their income from maintaining projects. So one particular thing I wanted to point out is also this data point around the 14% who said they're unpaid hobbyists and do not want to get paid for maintaining projects. So let's take this data point as a starting point. Seth, at first I want to start with you since you are our maintainer on this panel. When you look at these choices, which one would you use to describe yourself?
Yeah, I consider myself a semi-professional maintainer. I have a day job, full-time job outside of open source maintenance. And if I were to, I am paid. I have multiple income streams coming from open source, and those income streams do not sum up to an amount that would make it so that I could like stop doing that full-time job and do open source maintenance full-time. And obviously there's more than just money that comes into all of this, right? Like if you were to write me a contract that says, oh, for a year, we'll pay you this huge salary to do open source. If you quit your job, then you have to start thinking about things like the job market. You have to think about health insurance. You have to think about retirement. You have to think about all these things that are not necessarily something that's just purely like a monetary aspect, right? And so it's a really hard mountain to get over, this idea of I'm being paid to do open source versus this is the thing that I do exclusively is open source. So that's kind of where I'm at right now. It's a really tough problem, honestly.
Yeah, Lauren, when you look at this number, the 60%, that's an issue, right? That 60% of maintainers aren't getting paid. Like, why is that so dicey?
I like that word, dicey. It's dicey for a few reasons. I think first and foremost, when I think about the idea of a business and industry only paying 40% of their cloud infrastructure bill or 40% of their development salaries or compliance teams, they would not be expecting good results, good, reliable results from that level of investment. I think, industry knows that there's a definitive baseline of what it takes to run a business. And that's what jumps out to me first and foremost is that the degree to which industry is relying on unpaid effort is not it's not looking good from that sense. The other thing that stands out to me is there's risk here when open source is driving so much in terms of a foundation in these businesses and in terms of innovation as we look out ahead to the future. We know that open source has created a ton of momentum in terms of go to market, staying relevant, staying competitive, even when you're hiring developers. And so, yeah, those are the things that feel really dicey to me is that lack of investment in the today and the future, and then the lack of acknowledgement of the infrastructure that is underpinning your business that's very similar to a cloud infrastructure bill.
Right. And Al, as you said up front, you've been in the open source field for a while, and you've been watching this. Do you think most of the organizations, like leaders at organizations you talk to, would be surprised by this data? Do you think they already know this? How do they think about it?
I don't think they fully realize this, because if they realized it, I think they would be a lot more, willing to try to do something about finding a way to engage with the developers who are doing this maintenance. Truthfully, I mean, I think that it's partly caused by the fact that open source software has kind of been like a rising tide, right? So we started out where it was a collection of projects that were really literally hobbyist projects that over time became more commercially viable and at some point transitioned into being, recognized as a commercial solution. And I don't think the same recognition has followed that as to how the people who are creating these technologies and maintaining them, how they're actually accomplishing this. And frankly, I would argue that the creation part is important, but the maintenance part arguably is more important. And the reason why is because when you think about projects, something that's new, and let's just, right now everybody's talking about generative AI, right? That's the sort of project. Well, if I'm going to participate in an open source software project, that would be the thing that I'd probably want to be involved with because it's exciting, it's new, it would help my career. But the reality is these projects that have been around for 20 years or more still need somebody looking at them and maintaining them. And again, I agree that that's not something that most enterprises stop and think about.
Yeah, Seth, I'd be interested in your perspective on that. So if you think about as a maintainer, the sort of sexy creation work versus the unsexy janitorial work of maintaining these things. How do you kind of compartmentalize in your head where you're spending your time?
Yeah, actually, I would say that the vast majority of my time is spent on the work that is not this like new feature creation, greenfield work, right? It's almost entirely things that are not even technical, I would say. Things like community managing, things like project managing, things like finding new sources of funding, finding new maintainers to be able to do these tasks, right? Because if you're thinking about a long-term vision of a project and being able to know that that project is going to be around in 10 years, which is something that I think everyone that's depending on these projects expects or wants, you can't be thinking about greenfield stuff first. You need to be thinking about that long-term vision and sustainability. Like that's top of my mind most days when I get
Do you
to
think
work on your Lib 3.
do you think other maintainers approach it the same way you do, or when you look at your colleague maintainers out there in the field, are some of them more interested in the creation than the maintenance work? Do you think that's an issue?
100%. I think that there's a wide range of reasons why people are participating in open source, right? I'm a semi-professional. I'm paid by Tidelift, right? It makes sense for me to be thinking about a lot of these things compared to someone who has an itch to scratch, right? This is a super cool topic and I want to build something around it. Might as well make it available to other people to use too, right? And then, okay, well now you're maintaining that project, and maybe when you set off on that project, you weren't originally thinking that all of these new problems were going to be coming your way in 6 months to a year's time, right?
Hey, Chris,
Yeah.
I want to challenge Seth on one of his assumptions. And Seth, you threw out a number of 10 years. I would argue that that's like the minimum. I mean, there's plenty of enterprise applications that go in place and stay there for 20 years. And, so the life cycle of an installed technology is really, it can be considerably longer.
Yeah, definitely. I can only go off of the data that your Lib 3 has been around for 13, 14 years. Um, yeah, a lot of these projects that are super, super popular are fairly young. And then it's like, okay, do you want it to be around for how long now? Hopefully forever. So, but it's tough to say anything when you don't know the future, when you know that, in 10 years time, there's a really good chance that you and everyone that's on the project right now won't be around. Because if you look back in time, those 10 years, no one that was maintaining this project 10 years ago is on the project still. And so it's really hard to know with certainty what's going to happen in the future once your hands are off the project, right?
Yeah. One of the things that, on this data point that I've got on the screen right here that I found really interesting in these survey results is this was the first time we had asked this. We didn't ask this in a previous survey, but we asked the unpaid hobbyists to indicate, do they want to get paid? Like, do they like being an unpaid hobbyist or not? And there's this myth that I've heard over the years, or what I sort of think is a myth, that most maintainers don't want to get paid. They like being hobbyists and they like just doing this as a, for fun kind of thing. Our data here shows that the vast majority of maintainers actually either do get paid or want to get paid, and only 14% don't want to get paid. Was that surprising to any of you, or does it jibe with sort of what you were thinking you would see? Lauren, you're shaking your head.
Yeah, I don't find that surprising at all. I mean, again, even everything we've discussed in this conversation so far, everything around how do you go out and find income? How do you create community around a project to bring more and more contributors on and keep that project healthy? How do you do all the sort of security and the management and the maintenance work and the day to day before you even get to that greenfield place? I mean, it's so much work that is so unseen. It doesn't surprise me at all that people would want to receive income for that.
Well, let's dive a little deeper. Here's another data point. This is my inner data nerd coming out. I love these charts because it's just such it's intuitive what you're looking at here, but also it's just sort of, it's beautiful the way the data plays out. We asked maintainers, how much time do you spend per week maintaining open source projects? And those who consider themselves professional maintainers, 81% of them spend more than 20 hours a week. If you're a semi-professional maintainer like Seth, you're only spending, or only 27% of you are spending more than 20 hours a week. and that if you're an unpaid hobbyist, you're spending, depending on whether you want to get paid or don't want to get paid, only 7% or 2% of maintainers are spending more than 20 hours a week. I don't think we could see more clear data that shows the more maintainers are getting paid, the more time they can invest working on open source. Any thoughts when you look at this this particular chart from any of you? Anything you see?
Well, I'll
I
offer
think 10 hours might be generous. It's something that stands out to me. Sorry, Al, keep going.
no, that's okay. I mean, when I look at this chart, the first thing that hits me is like, most, if not, the vast majority of the people that responded to this particular data point, they have full-time jobs. So these are more than 20 hours per week on top of working 40 hours a week already. Now, when does that happen? At nights and the weekends? I mean, they're putting a lot of extra effort in that they don't have to do.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, maybe giving some color to what this means in actuality. Everyone on the right three charts is giving up hobbies, is not having relaxation time, is not spending time with their families or friends or all of these things, right? Like that's what this time represents. Because if you're not being paid professionally to maintain an open source project, if you don't have that like contractual obligation to do it, you are choosing to do this, like you can walk away any day and be scot-free. Like that's the reality of all of this, right? So
yeah, one other kind of underlying assumption that maybe we make when we look at this is like, how much time does it take to maintain an open source project or a set of projects? Like maybe some people think that you can do all the things that need to be done in 2 hours a week or in 1 hour a week. Seth, I don't know what your experience would be like maintaining a extremely popular open source package yourself. But what do you think, if you're doing the things that you think your users would expect to be doing, what do you think is the right amount of time per week for you to be spending on it?
It really depends on so many different factors. I mean, if you're a project that is in a good place in terms of community and everything, and maybe you have a lot of people around your project already, maybe you as a lead or as like a more senior maintainer, whatever that means, don't need to spend a ton of time on that extra because you already have the help. If it's a solo maintainer situation, right, the work that you're doing is going to be bursty, because if you're getting a task that comes in where it's like, I need to fix a bug, I have a security issue, you're going to have to put in more work than maybe you would normally have to in order to have that project continue onwards in a way that's acceptable to users, right? I think it just really depends, and there's a huge variety of answers on what would be acceptable for users or what would be acceptable for a maintainer to do with their time. And it gets even more complicated when you start talking about maintainers of multiple projects, right? If you have a week where a bunch of your projects are taking up your time, that week is going to be really full for you. But if it all aligns the other way, it's going to be a completely different way, right? There's definitely a curve of burstiness to this, I think, in all different projects. So.
Yeah, in one of our other sessions today, that's kind of a nice companion for this session where we do a maintainer State of the Union and asked 3 of our partner maintainers to join and kind of give their experiences. One of them, Gary Gregory, is one of the maintainers of Log4j. And when Log4Shell happened a couple of years ago, Gary told me he was on vacation and he had to cancel his vacation in order to do that. Again, as a hobbyist, as an unpaid hobbyist, he canceled his vacation. That shows you the dedication. But also, it probably depends on where in its life cycle a project is too. If it's still in growth mode and lots of new features being added and things like that, versus if it's relatively unchanged for several years, maybe it's something that would take less time, I would guess as well. Well, that's a nice place to segue into our second section of the conversation around industry and government standards. And let me set this up a little bit with, as you're listening to some of the sessions at Upstream, you'll hear a few people talk about this today. Lewis will chat about this a little bit in his keynote. Mike Milinkovic also in his keynote will be talking about some of these new policies. But if I'm just to sum this up in a minute, basically over the last couple of years, as you've seen this increase in vulnerabilities, cybersecurity attacks, some of which, like Log4Shell that we were just talking about, impact open source. You've seen this increase in interest from both government and industry in improving the standards around open source software security. So, at the US government level, things like this White House executive order that came out a couple of years ago sort of set the stage for a set of other things. Like the thing in the middle here is a department of the US government called NIST put out this thing called the Secure Software Development Framework, which is basically a whole set of best practices that organizations wanting to use secure software development practices should follow. And then another, part of the government, the Office of Management and Budget, put out a memo saying, basically, if you as a company want to sell software to the US government, you need to attest that your development practices meet this NIST standard. And so now organizations are really starting to pay attention to, gosh, like how am I going to go attest to these things? And then the place where it gets really sticky is they're actually being asked by the US government to attest to the software practices of even the open source packages they're bringing into their applications, yet they didn't create themselves. So they need to attest to somebody like Seth, his practices that he's using to do secure software development. Now, at the same time, all this is happening in the government, and I just gave you a couple of examples in the United States, this is happening around the world. And again, in Mike's keynote, he'll share some more examples of where this is happening around the world. But also on the industry side, you're seeing some of the leading industry organizations starting to put their sort of line in the sand of, here's what we think represents secure practices. The Open SSF has its scorecards project, which is giving a set of security standards that open source projects could meet. There's several other of these initiatives going on as well. Okay, so that's the quick background. So we asked some questions in our survey. In particular, we asked maintainers, which of the following industry standards initiatives are you aware of, just like simply aware of? And the headline here is that 52% of open source maintainers had never heard of the OSSF scorecards. They'd never heard of the NIST SSDF, and they had never heard of SALSA before. You can see only about a fourth of maintainers had heard of the top two choices, either Open SSF scorecards or the NIST SSDF, and very few had heard of SALSA. Okay, so first data point. Second data point, we asked maintainers who said they were aware, so just the subset of maintainers who said they were aware of these, we asked them, have you already or do you plan on beginning the work needed to ensure your projects align with one or more of these standards? So 43% have either already begun the work or plan to begin the work within the next year. But even the ones who've heard of it, 39% said they have no plans to do any of this. And then 19%, they don't know. They aren't sure. So you have over half of maintainers who have heard of them who aren't going to do anything. And then on top of that, you have a bunch of maintainers who haven't even heard of these in the first place. So Seth, I'm going to let me stay on this slide for a second. Seth, I'm going to start the questions with you here. Are you surprised that maintainers aren't more familiar with these standards? Were you familiar with some of these things already?
Yeah, I'm familiar with all of these, but I don't represent the typical case. I'm not really surprised at all that most maintainers are not up to date on every single thing that's happening in the open source security supply chain explosion of complexity that we're all living through right now. There's just so many things. There's so many things to learn, and every single thing that's happening in this space is completely additional and orthogonal to a lot of the typical motivations for people getting into open source work, right? You don't get into open source work like being excited to implement the security policies for your project. Like that's typically not the motivation for people joining and working on open source day to day. So it's all additional, right? This is all extra work that's being added on after the fact to people that have joined this as in a volunteer capacity. Typically, that's probably the primary reason why most people don't know about a lot of these things, is that it's all extra, it's all new, and it's all really complicated, and there's just a lot happening right now. So it's hard to sift through.
Yeah, in our third section, we'll talk a little bit about the maintainer motivations and why maintainers do this work. But I can already tell you, we didn't ask maintainers whether they got into open source specifically because they were interested in implementing government standards like NIST SSDF, but I don't think it would have been high on the list of reasons why maintainers decided to join a project. So Lauren, you've spent a lot of time looking at these standards. You probably, more than anyone I know, have actually read through every single line of that NIST SSDF and these other standards. What do you think when you look at this data?
I'm laughing. I am the only maintainer that started maintaining something about NIST SSDF. Yeah, I mean, when I look at this, first of all, just tying it back to, again, as a leader in a business, what are your expectations for internal development at your company, right? You would not expect a new development hire to understand what the expectations are for secure practices without having those layers of compliance and DevSecOps and standards and all those sorts of things. Which is something I actually really love about the SSDF, is that it points to all of that infrastructure that has to be in place, right? And it has to be invested in before you get to secure development outcomes. So when I look at this, I mean, I do think something that maybe doesn't appear quite in this data set, but we've learned when we've gone in and really focused on the OpenSSF scorecards, is there's also a lot of inherent, I think, skepticism about a framework or a set of standards kind of blanket applied to all of open source. There's a lot of nuance across different ecosystems, different types of packages, all those sorts of things. And so it's also really challenging to just blast something at the whole of open source without that nuance, is something that stands out to me.
Yeah, and Al, when you look at this data, like what's your sort of view on, like, do you think organizations, if I had asked this same question of your sort of organizational clients or the people you're talking to, are they aware of these standards? Would they be surprised if they are and they're looking at these things every day that more maintainers don't know about these?
I think it's going to depend on the industry segment that companies are in. So if say you're a government supplier or something like that, you probably are more aware of some of the governmental regulations and requirements. If you're just working in the private industry, maybe less so about the government things. But fundamentally, what troubles me the most is that basically 1 in 4 maintainers are saying they're actually starting to do something about it. It doesn't even mean they're done, right? It means they're just starting. Or they've begun some work. But what happens when these packages that they're relying on don't meet the standards that they need to in order to deliver a product to a particular customer?
Yeah, for sure. Sorry, my dog is yelling in the background here. All right, so a couple of more data points I wanted to share. So this first one, we asked maintainers, which of the following reasons describe why you don't plan to align to these industry standards? And so these were, just the people who said they don't have any plans to align to the industry standards, what they said as far as the reasons. And we sort of separated these out into, are they resource reasons, like I just don't have the time and I'm not being paid for the work? Are they clarity reasons, like I don't understand the standards or there's too many competing things? Or is it just other stuff? And the top answers were basically, I don't have the time and I'm not being paid for the work. Not super surprising there, but then let's look at another set of data points. We asked those same maintainers, what type of support would make it more likely that you would consider aligning to these standards in the future? And the number one thing that people are asking for is help understanding the new standards and how they apply to my project. And then number 2 would be getting paid to align to the new standards. This kind of goes back to, I think, what Seth was saying earlier about, the split of the work and why maintainers got into doing this in the first place. And is this the thing that they're passionate about and what drives them? The third thing was help aligning to the new standards. So this is interesting. So maintainers, like, maybe they just need some additional support. Maybe they either don't have all the necessary skills to do the work, or they just don't have the time and they'd love somebody else to help them figure this out. And then 13% said nothing would help them align to these standards. Any thoughts when you look at these data points?
Yeah, the tough thing for me is that, like, there's just so much happening, and like Lauren said, the blanket, we're just shooting it all out there and seeing what sticks, kind of. And I think it really needs to be a more targeted approach. A lot of these tools are trying to and it applies to everything. It's like, no, it doesn't apply to everything. Or, hey, everyone should do this. And it's like, well, there's actually a way better way to do that in a way that maybe in a more centralized or like targeting infrastructure or tooling rather than expecting work from everyone is a more sustainable approach to some of these policies, right? I think honestly, like the creating resources, partnering with maintainers, boiling it down to things that they just need to do. This is all you need to do. You don't need to even think about anything else. Like all of those steps would help with adoption and having people actually start doing these things, because it is a lot of confusing things happening. I ran a panel of this at PyCon, and a lot of people were just like, what do I need to do? And they want it to be boiled down to, what do I need to do? And if we can boil it down to that and make it so that it's really curated for your project, I think that would be incredibly helpful for a lot of these policies getting implemented in open source.
So Lauren, you're shaking your head, and I know you've spent a ton of time on this, just curating like what are the list of the standards that are going to have the biggest impact, and just helping maintainers understand like where should they focus first, because it may also be different for each ecosystem. Like some standards may not be as applicable in one ecosystem as another. But what are your thoughts, as far as what we could do to help maintainers understand these standards better?
Yeah, I mean, I think it really does. It comes down to the clarity, and the clarity is I think much more on the side of culling down the bulk of the noise, right? Rather than having to explain how to do something. But when you go in and you look at a specific standard, there's oftentimes a lot of back and forth of getting the clarity of how and when that it applies. Again, with that nuance per ecosystem, et cetera. Um, I think too, maintainers also know a lot of things about maintaining secure practices on their own projects. Seth and I spend a lot of time talking about this, right? How can we work more together to start to define something that does make more sense and could be more automated for maintainers and different working in those different ecosystems. So I think the opportunity here is not only clarifying and getting in really close community with maintainers to see adoption, but I think it's also really listening to maintainers and bringing what they have to say back up into these standards and making sure that voice is amplified.
So Al, if this work is important, like if this is things that organizations are having to maybe potentially attest that they follow practices like this, what do we do? Like if as you said earlier, most maintainers have zero interest in doing these anything about around these standards now, without something changing.
Yeah, and Chris, this kind of falls back to the point I made earlier, where this is part of the hard work of doing maintenance, which doesn't result in glitzy new features and isn't new technology, but rather just meeting requirements. And then that may not be fun to do, but it's something that has to be done. And the only way you can do that is give people a reason to do it. And frankly, I think that's the biggest thing here, is that we need to give maintainers a reason to want to do this, a reason to want to understand the standards that they need to meet. And without that, again, the packages actually would begin to lose value if they don't meet the standards that the industry needs.
For sure. All right, one last data point in this section, and this is going to be really a little bit of an eye chart for people to read. So I'm going to give you the headlines here. Is we asked maintainers which of the following, we basically gave them a set of common security, maintenance, and documentation practices that, in many cases are the types of things that are being asked for in the NIST SSDF or the Open SSF scorecards. We asked maintainers, which of the following practices have you implemented for most or all of the projects that you maintain? And then we asked them a follow-up question: of the practices that have not been implemented, which would you consider implementing into the future? And the headline here is that when you combine both the practices that have already been implemented and the practices they would consider implementing, for most of the most high priority security, maintenance, and documentation tasks, the difference between unpaid and paid maintainers, 20 to 30% more paid maintainers are either already doing or willing to do these sorts of tasks than unpaid maintainers. And some of these things are pretty scary. If I pick out a couple of data points, one of the basic security practices is provide fixes and recommendations for vulnerabilities. Well, 69% of paid maintainers doing that, 43% of hobbyist maintainers are doing that. You know, a disclosure plan about how you should be contacted about security issues. Again, 69% of paid maintainers doing that. 42% of unpaid maintainers doing that. And then, you know, other things like reproducible and verifiable build process, 77 to 47%. Formal policy about backwards compatibility, 71 to 39%. And a defined dependency management process, double the amount of maintainers, 57% versus 26% of paid maintainers are doing this. And it's across the board. What you can see is every single one of these, the purple lines you're looking at are paid maintainers. The gray lines you're looking at are unpaid maintainers. The gap is between 20 and 30+% across every single one of these practices. So when you look at this, you know, one of the questions I ask to myself is I say, like, shouldn't we just be paying maintainers to do these things? Like, is it that obvious? Is it that simple that we should be doing that? Why is this so complicated? You know, and why is this something that isn't just like standard across the board? I don't know, Seth, Al, any thoughts?
Well, you know, from where I sit, I mean, you know, when you're being paid to do something, let's face it, every job that any of us might have at any point in time, you know, if you put a pie chart full of the things you do, there's going to be a piece of the job that you like to do, a piece of the job that you maybe don't like to do, and a piece of the job that you have to do regardless. And it's that piece that you have to do. If you're being paid to do it, you know, it's part of what you get paid to do. And, you know, so it becomes a priority for you. If you're just doing this for fun and you're not being paid, you're probably going to gravitate toward the parts that are most interesting. You know, why would you do the things that are painful when you're doing it for fun?
Exactly.
It's hard to justify, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, from my perspective, a lot of these things that are especially security related, they have an impact on your life outside of when you close the browser window to the open source world, right? You walk away from the computer. If you've published a security policy, suddenly you are going to be responding to emails even if you didn't want to respond to those emails because you had something else to do or you're on vacation or, I mean, you're impacting your life by setting up a lot of these practices. And so I think that's a big contributor to why people would be hesitant to even start doing some of these things because going back on it also feels bad, right? Like if you have a security policy, taking down that security policy doesn't feel like the best thing to do. And so it's kind of a one-way street in a lot of people's minds, I'm sure. So it's a tough decision to make to say, yeah, we're going to do that. It has
So
a
that's
lot more
really
impact.
that's really interesting. It's almost like, from your perspective, Seth, it's almost like you're crossing a line. As soon as you start saying you're going to implement a security practice or whatever, you're crossing a line that as a hobbyist you maybe want to be very careful about crossing because it may be committing your free time.
Not only committing your free time, but you know, potentially, you know, making a commitment that people expect you to deliver on, and you know, there could be some responsibility associated with that.
Lauren, anything you'd add on this one?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really insightful that, you know, when you start to look at lists of things to be done, what's not immediately obvious is then what is then, you know, you've pulled the thread on the sweater, right? And now it's just going to keep coming off into your hands. And, you know, there is this whole, again, it's almost like multi layers of unseen labor underpinning all of these things. And I don't know how much more of an alarm bell that would need to raise for me as an industry leader if 70% of my software application was built on open source, and this is the degree to which I could rely upon these practices being in place. Again, I mean, it wouldn't be good enough in your own in the walls outside your own business. So it would be alarming to me to see this outside the walls.
Cool. All right. Well, let's hit our third section here. So let's talk a little bit about maintainer motivations, and I'm going to throw a couple of data points quickly at you, and then we're gonna talk about them. So, one question we asked maintainers, and this is the second time we've asked this question. So the full chart is on the left. I've highlighted some things on the right. We asked maintainers, "What do you enjoy about being an open source maintainer?" The number one thing is getting to work on projects that matter to me. The number two thing is making a positive impact on the world. And the number three is allows me to fulfill a need for creative, challenging, and enjoyable work. Conversely, down at the very bottom of the list, the second to bottom thing is only 14% of maintainers say one of the things they enjoy most is getting paid for their work. Okay, so that's what maintainers enjoy. They get to work on projects that matter, making a positive impact on the world, doing creative, challenging, enjoyable work. All right, now we asked them conversely, what do you dislike about being an open source maintainer? And the number one thing, and these, by the way, these little squiggly lines are showing the change from the last time we did this survey to this time we did this survey. But the number one is adds to my personal stress. Number two is not financially compensated enough or at all for my work. Number three is can be lonely. And number four, which is new, we didn't ask about this last time, but because of all this new government industry standards work, we asked them to rate asked to comply with requirements I don't have time for. And that weighed in for the first time at number four, right near the top of the list. All right, so that's what maintainers dislike. And then here's another data point. We asked maintainers, do you have any co-maintainers? If so, how many? 44% of maintainers identify as solo maintainers. So if you look at that, maintaining is a lonely job stat from the last one. This is why. 44% of maintainers are literally lonely maintainers, and only an additional 20% have only one co-maintainer. Only 11% have more than 10 co-maintainers. This is another scary chart. We asked this question last time, so what you're seeing is the little triangles are arrows showing the trend up and down from last time we asked, and basically it's flat. We asked maintainers, have you quit or considered quitting maintaining a project? 58% of maintainers have either quit or considered quitting a project, and only 43% have not considered quitting. So a majority of maintainers have at least thought about quitting this lonely work that they're doing, this lonely, stressful work. And then this chart shows what are the reasons why maintainers have considered quitting. And the top reasons are basically other priorities in my life. I lost interest, burnout, 44%. I wasn't getting paid enough to make it worthwhile, 38%. Took too much of my time. I didn't enjoy the maintenance work was another one. These are the reasons why maintainers are quitting or considering quitting. And then I think this is the last chart I want to show here is we asked maintainers what might stop them from quitting. So we said, what support might have kept you maintaining the project you quit or convinced you to keep maintaining the projects you've considered quitting? The number one answer, a tie for it, was earning more income from my maintenance work. Again, the getting paid for this work. And then number two was really interesting to me. Help finding another experienced maintainer or maintainers to join the project and share responsibilities, like relieving the loneliness, in other words, and relieving the stress maybe, or sharing the stress with other people. And then the third one was also really interesting, kind of a different take. And if you combine 2 and 3 together, it actually even rises above the level of number one, the earning more income. Help finding another experienced maintainer or maintainers to take over my projects so I can focus on those that interest me most. So some maintainers even want to actually quit their projects, but they can't quit because they feel responsible and want to find somebody else to take that over so that maybe they can focus on some other projects that are interesting to them. So this chart to me was a real eye-opener. When you look at this set of data points about why open source maintainers do the work and why they don't like doing the work and why they're quitting and why they're considering quitting, we should be concerned about this, right? I mean, Lauren, what do you see when you look at this whole set of charts?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that so many of these, I mean, I'm focused on this screen in front of us now, or they talk about connection, right? And it's there have been many years now of hand-wringing about how to put money in open source, but there's a lot of things on this list that any consumer of open source can participate in and make a difference in. So that's something that kind of jumps out to me immediately. The one of the first slides that you showed where the stress has gone up so much, definitely it hits me in the heart to see that.
Seth, what do you think when you look at this? how do maintainers get this help that they need today? Like, what would make it easier to get, especially the non-financial help? I mean, the money side of it, I think we've sort of established is fairly obvious, but some of these other things beyond money, like what do we do to give maintainers like you the additional help you need to be successful?
Yeah, honestly, the having more individuals around, I definitely like I feel the loneliness of all those people that are responding that way, because it's night and day the difference between when I was lead maintainer of EuroLib 3 before Quentin, my co-maintainer, came along. Right, it is night and day. It is a world of a difference to have even one more person who is, in the driver's seat with you, right? And humans, for the most part, are social creatures, right? Like you're just going to derive so much more like meaning and joy from an experience if you're able to share it with someone. So I think that is just huge, right? Like having one other person. Like how can we as an industry get one other person on every project, even if it needs something along the lines of, you're spending like a small percentage of your time as someone who's a consumer of open source just contributing back, or like putting input on issues or project direction, or like even if you're not willing to become that maintainer, having active contributors or having people that keep coming back to projects, I say like is pretty comparable in terms of like having another maintainer or just having a really active community, even if it is just one or two individuals, right? It makes a world of a difference.
Al, any thoughts from you before we leave the maintainer motivation section here?
I mean, Seth really summarized it pretty well. I mean, the only thing I'll add is that I've always found, no matter what kind of work I'm doing, when you have somebody to collaborate with, if you're struggling to solve a problem, a lot of times they say, "Oh, have you thought about trying this or trying that?" And just having that second person to bounce an idea off of is really helpful.
Great. Well, let's give some closing thoughts here. So, as we look at these three areas we've talked about today, so first, this sort of crisis of either underpaid or unpaid maintainers who are being asked by industry and government to do a lot more stuff and are, in many cases, lonely, stressed out, and overworked. I mean, that sounds really depressing. I would love for y'all to end by giving me some hope. Like what can we do? Like what's the optimistic take here? What can we do to make this better? And Lauren, I want to start with you.
Oh, optimism. All right. This has been a challenging, challenging 45 minutes. I mean, my optimism always comes from spending time with maintainers, right? The passion there, the connections that they do make, right, across geopolitical boundaries is really inspiring to me as a person living in 2023. I think that we are in an era now where it's becoming really important that there are things that go into secure outcomes that come way before an emergency vulnerability, which gives me a lot of hope that excuse me, we're entering an era where new models are going to be showing up, new ways of repairing some of these problems. And as I said earlier, maintainers themselves have fantastic ideas about how to address some of these problems too. So for me, it's being in that close community with those folks.
Al, give me your optimism. What do you see?
Well, so the industry overall, we continue to move to a higher level of abstraction from the underlying compute resources. Right, there was a time where we used to write in assembly language. We don't do that anymore. We use higher level languages. Now we're using generative AI to actually produce code. So the industry continues to abstract up higher and higher, which means that all the infrastructure below that layer becomes the responsibility of somebody who's providing that service to you. So my expectation is that at some level, the vendors that are delivering that infrastructure, meaning specifically the cloud vendors, are going to have to take an interest in making sure this infrastructure software is reliable and safe. And I think that it's going to be, it's going to be something they're going to have to focus on and invest either in the maintainers themselves or take on some of the maintenance responsibilities themselves to do that. What that doesn't necessarily address is the developer community, where we've got developer tools that are being created. We've got libraries and things like that aren't part of the infrastructure software stack. And those are areas where we have to focus on. But again, given the movement of the industry and the immense awareness that we have today of the vulnerabilities that could exist and the outcomes if we don't address those vulnerabilities, I do think that that's raising the visibility. It's going to force the industry as a whole to find ways to do a better job.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Seth, why don't you give us the final word here?
Yeah, for me, a reason to be just excited about the future is I think that we're at the very, very beginning of this curve of adoption, right? This curve of interest and of better visibility into what's happening in the open source world and how open source is being consumed. I really think that what I've seen so far in this curve is a lot of things that I really love about open source in a lot of these initiatives, right? Working in the open, being collaborative, working in a way that is beneficial for everyone and not just yourself. And I think that one of the biggest pieces that's easy to get wrong is this part of partnering with the actual people. That's something that I really love about Tidelift. Tons of other organizations are also getting this right, where there is that component of there's people in the supply chain, and we need to partner with them, and we need to know what they need, and we need to think about them in everything that we do. A lot of the security policies and tooling and all of that around that's being built right now is really taking those people into account. And I think that that's why this new wave of security policies and tooling is going to reach a level of adoption that is just so much more than we've ever seen before. So that's why I'm really excited about this secure and sustainable and just all around better for everyone future for open source.
Seth, Lauren, Al, thank you so much for your time and your insights. Appreciate all of you joining today. Thanks everyone who joined us for this session, and enjoy the rest of the day at Upstream.